All right, Peter Greenberg, it is great to have you. Greenberg and I go back to our time at CBS News, where he is still the travel editor, but you can watch all of his coverage via petergreenberg.com. Peter, good talking to you.
Indeed. Nice to see you, Moshe.
So we are chatting just over 24 hours now since the collision and crash in Washington. When you first saw the headline and find out what happened, given your knowledge and experience here, knowledge of the airport, the airlines, all of the above, what was your gut reaction?
My first question was, what was the helicopter doing in restricted airspace? Washington Reagan has the most restricted airspace of any airport in the United States, obviously going back to 9/11, its proximity to the Capitol and the White House. And they have there something called the TCA. It's now at every major airport and has been for over 40 years.
TCA is what?
It stands for Terminal Control Area. It's restricted airspace around an airport, and no plane can enter that TCA without being given permission by the controllers. And then you have to do something called squawk on your transponder. And what that means is it sends a signal to the controllers of your identification of the plane, your altitude, your speed, and your direction, so that the controllers know they can talk directly to you. That's every airplane flying into every major airport in the United States. So the question was the helicopter also allowed to be in the TCA? And as it turns out, it was. And they were in communication with the tower as well. Now, here's where it gets confusing, because you have the American Eagle flight, the CRJ 700, lined up in its final approach to land on runway 33.
The plane was where it was supposed to be.
The plane was absolutely where it was supposed to be. And in fact, it was doing everything it was supposed to do. It was at about 500 feet in its final maybe 30 seconds before touching down. At that moment, the controllers called out to the Sikorsky Blackhawk to say, hey, be aware there's traffic in the area. Do you spot it?
Right. This audio has been released.
Correct. And the pilot of the helicopter confirmed that he'd spotted the traffic and that he was maintaining adequate separation. So far, so good, except that about 8 seconds later, he smashes into that plane, and we all know what happened next. So the question then becomes, at what altitude was that helicopter flying, and was it the correct altitude, number one? And number two, when he said he confirmed the traffic, was he referring to the same plane? There's other traffic in the area. Number three, he was flying using night vision goggles, which does limit your visibility, even though it was a clear night. So you have all those things in concert that may have created this problem. Now, having said that, it's still very early in the investigation. And what the investigators will do here, as they do in every accident investigation, is they will painstakingly rule everything out before they can ever rule any one thing in. There'll be many, many different go teams assigned to this crash, ranging from human factors to engineering, electronics, fuel.
Explain
weather.
go teams. So go teams, these are separate teams that look into individual potential culprits.
Yes, and they're made up of individual specialists, either from manufacturers or regulators. So you could have as many as 12 different go teams in any one crash investigation, not counting the Army's own board of inquiry, and then all the state and federal agencies that are at work there, the Coast Guard, Maryland, Virginia, and the District of Columbia. Last but not least, of course, the fire department. But it's all under the leadership, as it always will be and has been, of the National Transportation Safety Board. These are the real heroes. These are the guys and women who do the real tough work in the most adversarial conditions, and they are determined to find the probable cause. But then comes the interesting challenge in every accident investigation, because once they do find the probable cause, and by the way, they will do that here, then they make urgent safety recommendations to the regulatory agency, in this case, the FAA, the Federal Aviation Administration. And then it's up to them to implement those solutions so that accidents like this never happen again. And we have a sad history with the FAA when it's presented with these urgent safety recommendations and the solution, and where the solution is even able to be implemented. In many cases, the FAA either slow walks it or ignores it, because they're more concerned with the economic impact on either the manufacturer or the operator, the airlines, in implementing those solutions, which is a complete conflict of interest.
So what you're saying is that ultimately, in this case, American Airlines, other airlines, they have a financial incentive to push back on any recommendations here that potentially mean lesser landing slots. I mean, go through, we spoke about this. I mean, I called you the morning after the crash. I was like, Peter, what's your gut on this? And, ultimately the first thing that you brought up was how busy this airspace is, and that one of the recommendations is probably going to slow things. One of the recommendations is to slow things down.
Oh, I think that's inevitable now, especially for that airport. They're going to change the separation rules both for takeoffs and landings.
What's the separation rule?
Meaning, how much time do you need from one landing to another landing? How much time from one takeoff to another takeoff? Because if you needed to, on any runway, you could do one takeoff every 2.5 minutes, right? You could do 23 takeoffs in an hour, 23 landings in an hour.
Is that the max?
Well, yeah, but given 2.5 minutes of separation, yeah, that's the max. But remember, people are not just heavily tasked in the air. They're heavily tasked on the ground, which explains how so many airports now are reporting on the ground clippings of wings and congestion on the tarmac. So we have to be able to address that as well. This opens the door to a lot of different issues that need to be addressed.
And one of the questions, and you brought it up, is this chopper that was basically flying basically through what is a landing route for a plane. Now, anyone who's been to Washington, it's hard to go an hour in DC without hearing a helicopter overhead.
Correct.
Between local law enforcement, all the federal agencies, the military, the Pentagon is right there on the water. This was from Fort Belvoir, which is about 15 miles away. Is it a very careful dance in Washington? I mean, how does all this air traffic work together?
Well, the left hand has to talk to the right hand. And operationally, what you see is that military aircraft operate on their own radio frequencies unless they're entering the TCA, at which point they have to talk to the Reagan Tower or the Dulles Tower or the Baltimore Tower. But what needs to come back now, maybe they have to operate on the same frequencies no matter where they're flying so people can track them easier. There's something else called the TCAS. Let me explain that. It's called the Collision Avoidance System. It's on every modern commercial jet aircraft. It's an interactive system on every plane, and the systems talk to each other. So if you have two planes that are ostensibly flying on a collision course, one system will automatically recognize that, as will the other system, and they'll immediately give the pilots commands. Climb right, dive right. So that, and the pilots are trained not to question that, but just to do it.
So basically, the systems talk to each other, and they tell the planes to take opposite routes, basically, to avoid collision.
To take aggressive avoidance action. Now, right now, the way the systems are set up, they don't work below 1,000 feet. So even if the helicopter had it last night, it would not have made a difference.
Right. The plane was coming in. You said 30 seconds from landing, about 140 miles per hour, 400 feet. Even then, it's a pretty close call, remarkably, if the chopper was supposed to be 200 feet and the plane's at 400 feet.
Well, here's the problem, and this is what they're investigating now. They know the chopper was more or less where it was supposed to be based on what they were talking to him about, but they don't know what his altitude was. Was he flying higher than he should have been? Right? And 150 feet difference can make a huge difference as you have one plane descending. So that's one of the things the investigators will be looking at.
What are people in the industry telling you today? Was this sort of thing, have we been lucky that this hasn't happened? Because I'm seeing reports now of the number of close calls that we've been having in recent years. Well,
let me start with the good news. Last year, about 4.4 billion people flew around the planet, and the number of fatalities and accidents is under like 700. Now, if you do the math, those are odds that are overwhelmingly in your favor. Now, there's certainly, it's very, very sad, and we can investigate all those deaths and see how many of those were avoidable. But just looking at the numbers, those are pretty incredible odds.
Now, right. Yeah, I've seen the number that you have a 1 in 14 million chance in America of dying in a plane crash. You have a 1 in 5,000 chance of dying in a car crash.
Correct. But now let's go beyond that, because we've had ostensibly, over the last 30 years, the safest period of commercial aviation since aviation began. And so the question you need to ask is, can we improve on that? It's such a good track record. And the answer is maybe, maybe not. But the real challenge is not that question. The real challenge is, can we maintain it? And the way the system is set up right now, with the FAA not behaving the way it should over a long period of time in terms of maintenance, in terms of oversight of manufacturing, in terms of inspection and enforcing safety regulations, we've got some problems.
So I go back to the question then, are we lucky that basically we've gone 16 years since that Colgan air crash outside Buffalo there?
Right.
Has it been just a matter of sheer luck, or is part of it that the system is a pretty safe system?
The system more or less has worked, and it's worked well because remember, there's so many different component parts to that system. It's introducing the concept of the sterile cockpit so that in the last 30 minutes of the flight, the pilots can't be talking about a football game. They can't talk about who they dated last night. It's only about the performance of the plane, and it's rigidly enforced. It's better training, better simulator training. All that has helped a lot. It's better equipment. It's state of the art, right? You're adding more and more things into the cockpit, heads-up displays, better satellite navigation, better weather radar. All that plays a part. But at the end of the day, if you're not watching the store properly by the FAA and not doing the right oversight, either at the manufacturing level, the maintenance level, or the operational level, there are problems about to happen. And remember, we're dealing with the FAA's air traffic control system, where we have 3 air traffic control centers right now that are operating below the 85% staffing threshold. That's not acceptable because in those areas, those controllers are being forced to work mandatory overtime. The one job on the planet, you don't want anybody working overtime. So what happened? Finally, last year, in the FAA reauthorization bill, they were given the money to hire about 1,500 new controllers. But they're not working today. The steep learning curve is going to take 2 to 2.5 years before any of them will be allowed to sit at a console by themselves. So the problems are still very much there.
Yeah, one of the reports that's already come out in the first 24 hours was at this particular tower at Reagan National, you had the air traffic controller doing double duty, talking to both the helicopter and the plane, and typically they would want 2 people doing that job.
That's true, but what we may discover in the investigation here is while that's true, it may not have had a real direct impact on what happened, but still not acceptable.
Yeah, and Reagan's been understaffed. Nationally, they've been understaffed. How did this happen? You know, it seems like there are, important jobs out there, among them ensuring the safety of millions of Americans on a daily basis who are in the air.
Well, you know what? As we now embrace the whole concept of artificial intelligence, let's not forget to address the aspect of natural stupidity. Because remember, we go back to 1981 when Reagan fired the air traffic controllers.
This is a pivotal moment, right?
It was a pivotal moment. And who did they replace them with? Military air traffic controllers who did a reasonably good job. But then they had no plans for replacing them as they basically had tritted out due to age and retirement. And
Wait, remind us what happened in 81. The air traffic controllers went on strike?
They wanted to go on strike.
Mm-hmm.
And Reagan said, if you go on strike, you're fired. They went on strike and they were fired. And Reagan took a position, right? The union was decimated. They brought in military air traffic controllers to basically fill that void, and then started hiring a little bit. But 20 years later, by 2001, those guys were retiring. Those guys were leaving, and there was never proper adequate preparation by the FAA in terms of their hiring to basically fill those jobs, and they've never caught up since.
So the FAA, the air traffic controller is perpetually understaffed,
Correct.
Overworked. I saw numbers out there that the average one is working 6 days a week, 10-hour days.
But you know what? It's even worse than that because it's about the equipment they're using. The FAA has been talking for 30 years about something called next-gen equipment. They've gone through 3 gens already without that equipment. And by the time they ever get the appropriation done and go through all the federal bidding, by the time they actually install that equipment, it will be out of date. So we have to come up with different procurement rules, especially when it deals with our safety, and they haven't done that either.
Who are we blaming for this? Congress, the president, all of the above?
Let's go with all the above, Jack. No, but seriously, because Congress has to authorize the funding, the FAA has to lobby in the proper way, and the president has to make it a national mandate. Because It is that important to commerce. It is that, forget safety. Just look at the commercial aspects. You may remember after 9/11, planes didn't fly for 5 days. The airspace was shut down in America. Do you know why they flew in the sixth day? Not because the environment was suddenly safer. They flew in the sixth day because in those days, if I wrote you a check on my bank in California and you lived in New York, it took 6 or 7 days for that check to clear, right? It was way before electronic clearance. So all of a sudden, banks were on the verge of insolvency in America because no money was clearing. Because they were those bags of checks going between banks and the Federal Reserve were being flown by what? Commercial air carriers as cargo. That's what started the planes flying again. Now, today we have electronic clearance. There's no such thing as the float on personal checks. They get cleared right away. But the point being, there's an economic impact here if we don't have airplanes in the air. And you don't need to be a math whiz to do those numbers. So you can easily make this a national mandate. The safety aspects are not arguable in terms of equipment, staffing, or training, not to mention the enforcement of regulatory rules and oversight by the FAA. And they've not done a good job.
When did the FAA become so amenable, friendly to the airlines?
You're not going to like this answer. When the FAA was established by an act of Congress back in 1935, they were given a dual mandate that was literally impossible to perform. The first part of the mandate was, and we embrace this, to enact and enforce safety. But the second part of the mandate, which is the conflict of interest of all conflicts, was to, quote, promote the business of aviation. You cannot do both.
And it's still 90 years later, it's got the same
mandate. And so what we have right now is a situation which we've had for decades where the FAA has mistakenly looked at the airlines and the manufacturers as either their partners or their clients. They're not their partners. They're not their clients. Their clients are the citizens of the United States of America who need to have them do a better job. And when you see the FAA slow walk something that needs to be done, let me give you an example. If I know there's a problem on a plane and we investigate it because we don't know why it happened, and then because the NTSB does such a great job, we not only find out why it happened, but how we can fix it and that there's a solution available to be used and implemented. And then we make a conscious choice at the FAA level not to implement that solution. Look, I'm not a practicing attorney. I'm not an attorney, but I could handle this prosecution. That's criminal negligence. And that's what we're seeing over decades of time because the FAA is more concerned about the economic impact of doing new safety revisions and improvements than they are about the actual improvements themselves. And by the way, this is not an accusation by me. These are facts.
One thing that has been discussed in the last 24 hours is the fact that there's no permanent head of the FAA right now. That last gentleman resigned on January 20th,
Right.
among other things, had an issue with Elon Musk because he had fined Elon Musk over SpaceX. And so there's a lot of political finger pointing happening.
Well,
How big a deal is it that there's no permanent head of the FAA right now?
Well, earlier today, Trump did nominate someone.
Right.
Who comes from the National Business Aircraft Association. So
at least his acting, he made him acting.
Of course, they're all acting pending confirmation. Yeah. But at least there's somebody now doing the job. But it's going to be a steep learning curve for him as well.
But the fact that this happens at a point of presidential transition, et cetera, does that make things more challenging? Does that impact things?
Well, if you take a look historically at presidential transitions, whether it's Republicans turning into Democrats or Democrats turning it over to Republicans, there are certain key jobs in terms of the operation of government. The people just don't get fired or told to go home until there's somebody ready to take their place in the normal transition of power. One of those areas is safety, FAA, or the National Highway Transportation Safety guys, or the Federal Trade Commission, or the FDA. You just don't say go home and we'll see you when we figure it out. That's not what happened here.
I want to head back to the site of the crash. Talk to me about the unique nature of Reagan National Airport. I was a college student at GW down in Washington when 9/11 happened. I remember how long that airport was closed for. I remember the debate about whether to even reopen it, given its proximity to the White House and the Capitol and the Pentagon, et cetera. Describe for us the unique challenges of Reagan Airport and both for pilots, for the military, all of the above.
Well, let's start with the convenience of the airport and its location. You got to love the airport for that. It's maybe a 12-minute ride from the White House to get to the airport, or from Wisconsin Avenue for that matter.
Yeah, you can if you're in a certain part of the city, you can leave an hour before your flight and make your flight.
You can. And we love that convenience aspect of it, always have, as opposed to schlepping all the way out to Dulles. However, the way the airport is laid out, every pilot is under strict rules. It's part of their protocol that the minute you take off, you have to make an immediate turn, because otherwise you'll be flying right over the White House. That's how close it is. So that's why they were worried about reopening it after 9/11, because it was so easy for someone to just use that plane as a weapon of mass destruction, or any plane, and fly it right into the White House before anybody would have a chance to defend that building. By the way, that's still the case today. So there's concern about that. There's concern about the fact that the runways are not that long. So you're limited by the kinds of planes you can fly to Reagan, and many of them can be weight restricted if they are larger. There's a perimeter rule that, you can't, there are very few there are very few cross-country nonstops flown out of Reagan. Every once in a while when they did that, that was to satisfy a senator who was sitting on the Senate Aviation Subcommittee. I remember when TWA put in a nonstop flight from Reagan to Phoenix. That was for John McCain. They even had a nonstop flight once from Reagan to South Dakota to satisfy Larry Pressler when he was the senator from South Dakota.
Right, this is the favored airport. I mean, one of the arguments that's made is one of the only reasons they reopened this thing after 9/11 is because members of Congress like to fly out of here.
Oh, it's Congress's airport, no doubt about it. No doubt about it. So there's a trade-off there, which you can be in denial about, but you also have to be aware about it. And that is, it is very close to the White House. It's very close to the Capitol. And that's a potential security problem.
There's been talk about just how they've been maxing out slots at that airport, that it basically, they're overworking, given the confines, given the limits that you described the airport, that they're, vastly overcommitted.
They're already stretched out because, remember, you can't expand the footprint of the airport. You can't expand the length of the runways. You can't expand their real estate. It is what it is. Now, considering what it is, it does a reasonably good job, but they are at the max right now.
So this isn't your first rodeo, Greenberg. Describe for us, lay out the next few months and years here. What likely will be recommended? What should we expect happens next?
Well, if everybody does their homework and the NTSB, will do theirs, then we're going to see a situation which will not just apply to Reagan, but to many other airports, which are also suffering from congestion. And that is, they're going to change the separation of planes. They're going to change nighttime operational rules. And hopefully with a new Secretary of Transportation, the hope is with him and the new acting administrator, who then may become permanent, they'll reapproach the definition of how they were started as a federal agency in the first place and start doing the job they were really supposed to do.
When you talk about changing separation, so they go from 2.5 minutes to 3 minutes apart, 4 minutes apart, like how significant would the changes be there?
That's a lot. It can be significant if you add 2 to 3 extra minutes.
Yeah.
Because remember, it's not just the planes that are landing, it's the planes that have to cross runways and taxiways. It's congestion at the gates. If the plane doesn't push out, what happens to the plane that lands? He has nowhere to go, right? So that's going to force the airlines to change their schedule and for once, maybe publish a schedule that's realistic, not competitive. Look, there's not a runway in the world, whether it's Reagan or Rwanda, that can accommodate more than 23 takeoffs in an hour. And that's given 2.5 minutes of separation. So why are the airlines allowed to schedule 40 planes departing at 8 o'clock in the morning? That's a joke, right? And they want to be competitive on schedule, but they're not being competitive in reality. And then, of course, that creates a physical problem with too many planes in the wrong place at the wrong time.
And I was going to say, at a time where more Americans are traveling than ever,
right,
you're going to start to see that there's just less flights going out. Prices will go up. Less seats are available. I mean, this all has a trickle, right?
It does. But you know what? Then all of a sudden, the Baltimore airport becomes very exciting. and becomes a good alternative. Islip in Long Island as opposed to LaGuardia. Providence in Rhode Island instead of Boston. Oakland and San Francisco instead of San Francisco. Milwaukee instead of O'Hare. There are alternatives that can be explored that are not going to really disadvantage passengers. In fact, in many cases, it works. If you look at the parking lot of the Milwaukee airport right now, 1/3 of the license plates of the cars there are Illinois plates. They already know.
Yeah, no. As someone born in Chicago, I've flown through there a couple times.
Yeah.
There's always been talk in Chicago. I mean, going back to when I was growing up of creating a third airport, right? A robust airport in Chicago.
Yeah,
and it's never quite happened.
And that's not going to happen. They can't even figure out if they want a new runway at O'Hare. So they're also at the max.
I was going to ask, are there areas of America that aren't at the max? I mean, beyond the Reagan DC environment, I know New York is overcommitted. Are there certain areas of the country that are super congested right now?
There are airports in America that are underutilized, lots of extra gate space. I already mentioned Islip, MacArthur Field in Long Island, where you have a huge population base, lots of space to play there. Cincinnati is an airport. Indianapolis is an airport. Kansas City is an airport. They have tremendous amount of opportunities there for people to fly to or through. Absolutely.
Right. It just means that it's less convenient for you. It'll mean more time on the ground to get to your destination.
Right. But keep in mind that we're seeing over the last 3 years, the major carriers, American, United, and Delta, pull out of airports in America that either have less service now or no service at all. Toledo, Ohio. I don't think they have any of the 3 major carriers anymore. So if you live in Toledo, the choice that you have is you have to drive to Detroit to be able to fly out of there. What that does to the infrastructure of Toledo is not pretty, especially if you're doing business there. We're seeing, 25 different cities that have either lost some service or have lost all service, and that's not good either.
What happens, I mean, given that this collision involved the U.S. military, how does that change things here? And what does it mean for them in D.C.?
Well, they're going to have their own board of inquiry. That happens in any military accident. But again, the lead here is the National Transportation Safety Board. And my gut tells me that once they basically secure all the remains and the bodies, then they're going to start preserving as much of the evidence as they can. And what that may lead to is a complete reconstruction and a hangar of that American Eagle plane as well as the helicopter, so that as they come up with a second-by-second timeline based on the radio transmissions and the transcripts, they can actually see the actual physical damage, which will allow them to do a better job of the investigation.
Yeah, so they'll be able with the technology here to basically establish a second-by-second who was at what elevation, who was at what speed. We're going to eventually find that all out.
Without a doubt.
How does the way that Trump has reacted in the first 24 hours impact things? He's tried to lay blame DEI, et cetera.
Well, listen, every accident investigator will tell you the one area that you never go into is politics. You can't politicize this. If there were Republicans on that plane and Democrats on that plane and independents on that plane, this transcends politics. We've got to get to the root of what happened. And as I just said, when we first started talking today, you and me, it's preliminary. Everything that I'm telling you, I have to caution you that it's too early for me to tell you in a definitive way. Right. I have my instincts, but I can't tell you this is what happened, and neither can the president. So we need to take some time here to give it the proper context and perspective and let the NTSB do their work.
And I just want to end here because, when things like this happen, even people who don't have a fear of flying start to develop a fear of flying. A reminder again, Peter, context on the state of air safety.
We've never had a safer period of air safety than in the last 30 years. And the odds are overwhelmingly in your favor. But the challenge is, and that's going to be a challenge until I report otherwise, whether or not the authorities, the operators, the manufacturers can maintain that safety record. And based on the behavior that I've seen over the last 20 years, I'm a little worried. But that doesn't stop me from flying. I fly 450,000 miles a year. I'm flying 300 days a year. So let's just say I'm not worried.
Peter Greenberg, thank you for the insight, for the history here, and we'll continue to check in with you as we learn more about this.
You got it, Moshe.